Every child deserves to feel safe and loved in their own home. Yet for one young girl, her broken-down cabin became both shelter and shame, a place where cruel whispers from neighbors cut deeper than any winter wind. In a small town where judgment came easier than kindness, 12-year-old Maya lived alone in a crumbling cabin with only her faithful dog, Rex, for company. The townspeople mocked her patched clothes and weathered home, never seeing the strength it took to survive each day. But beneath that scorned piece of land lay a secret that would change everything. A discovery worth $150 million. But what really happens when the girl everyone had dismissed suddenly holds the key to their entire town's future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Maya's front porch, highlighting every crack and splinter that told the story of decades past their prime. She sat on the sagging steps, her fingers wrapped around a tarnished silver locket, the only thing of beauty she owned and the only connection to the mother she barely remembered. The locket held a tiny photograph of a woman with kind eyes, and Maya's same determined jawline, worn smooth by countless anxious touches over the years. Rex lay beside her, his golden coat catching the early light as his ears twitched at every sound from the waking neighborhood. The German Shepherd mix had been her constant companion for 3 years now, ever since he'd shown up as a scrawny puppy on her doorstep during the worst winter storm anyone could remember. Maya had shared her meager dinner with him that first night, and he'd never left her side since. The cabin behind them leaned slightly to the left, its roof patched with mismatched shingles and tarps that fluttered in the morning breeze. What had once been white paint now peeled away in curling strips, revealing grey wood beneath that had weathered countless seasons. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, requiring a firm shoulder to open and a harder push to close properly. 3 of the 4 windows were cracked, held together with tape that had long since lost its stickiness but remained out of stubborn necessity. Maya had learned to see beauty in small things, the way morning light filtered through the old oak tree beside her home, casting dancing patterns across the worn floorboards inside, the cheerful yellow wildflowers that insisted on blooming along her fence line despite the poor soil, the satisfied warmth that filled her chest when she managed to fix something that had broken, using nothing but determination and whatever materials she could scrounge. She remembered fragments of life before the cabin, mostly impressions of warmth and laughter, the smell of cinnamon and the sound of her mother humming while she cooked. Amelia Johnson had been a house cleaner for the wealthier families across town, working long hours to support herself and Maya after Maya's father disappeared when she was barely 2 years old. The memories were hazy now, filtered through the understanding of a child too young to grasp the weight her mother carried. The cancer had come swift and merciless when Maya was 9. In the space of 6 months, Amelia went from a vibrant woman who danced while she folded laundry to someone Maya barely recognized in that stark hospital bed. The state had tried to place Maya with foster families, but she'd run away each time, always finding her way back to the cabin that her mother had somehow managed to buy outright during better times. After the 4th escape, and with overworked social services stretched thin, they'd eventually given up active pursuit, checking on her sporadically, but allowing her to remain in the only home she'd ever known. Maya had taught herself to survive, with a combination of fierce determination and quiet resourcefulness that would have made her mother proud. She knew which neighbors sometimes left day-old bread on their back steps, though she was careful never to be seen taking it. She knew where the best blackberry bushes grew wild beyond the town limits, and which seasonal jobs paid cash to someone willing to work hard without asking too many questions. The Hendersons 3 houses down were kind enough, though they kept their distance. Martha Henderson would sometimes wave from her garden, and once had brought over a casserole after Maya had been sick with fever for several days. But even their kindness came wrapped in a careful distance, as if poverty might be contagious. The Millers, directly across the street, were another story entirely. Harold Miller made sure everyone within earshot knew exactly what he thought about that girl living like a wild animal and bringing down property values with that eyesore of a shack. His wife, Patricia, would purse her lips and whisper to other neighbors about what kind of community allows a child to live in such conditions, though she'd never once offered to help improve those conditions. Then there were the Fosters, whose pristine white colonial sat at the end of the street like a monument to suburban perfection. James Foster served on the town council and never missed an opportunity to suggest that Maya's property was unsuitable for habitation and should be appropriately addressed by the authorities. His teenage son, Kyle, took particular pleasure in walking past Maya's fence with his friends, making comments loud enough for her to hear about trailer trash and welfare queens, despite Maya having never received government assistance beyond the free school lunch program. Maya had learned to hold her head high when she walked to school, even when the whispers followed her down the hallways. Her clothes were clean, carefully mended and pressed with the ancient iron she'd learned to use without burning herself. Her homework was always completed, often by candlelight when the electricity had been shut off, though she'd learned to manage the utilities well enough to keep them on most of the time through careful budgeting of her odd-job earnings. Rex seemed to sense the undercurrents of tension that surrounded their daily life. He was protective without being aggressive, positioning himself between Maya and anyone whose energy felt threatening. When the foster boy and his friends got too close to their fence, Rex would stand and watch them silently until they moved along, never barking or snarling, but somehow communicating that their presence was noted and unwelcome. The dog had an intelligence that constantly amazed Maya. He seemed to understand not just her words, but her emotions, appearing with a gentle nudge whenever sadness threatened to overwhelm her. On the worst days, when the loneliness felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, Rex would rest his head in her lap and stay perfectly still until the feeling passed. Lately, though, Rex had been exhibiting behavior that puzzled Maya. For the past several weeks, he'd been spending increasing amounts of time in the backyard, pacing along a particular section near the old oak tree. At first, Maya thought he might be tracking a mole or some other small creature, but his interest seemed more focused than that. He would stand in the same spot each day, ears forward, nose to the ground, as if he were listening for something only he could hear. The backyard itself was a testament to years of neglect, though Maya had made efforts to tame the worst of it. Wild grass grew in uneven patches between bare spots where the soil seemed too poor to support much growth. A rusty tool shed leaned against the back fence, its door held shut with a loop of wire. Maya had discovered it contained mostly junk. Old paint cans, a broken lawnmower, tools so rusted they crumbled at the touch. But the land itself held a strange beauty that Maya had always felt but never quite understood. Sometimes, especially in the early evening light, she would sit on her back steps and feel as though the ground beneath her feet was somehow significant, as if it held stories she couldn't quite hear. Her mother had loved this yard, she remembered. That much. Amelia would sit out here in the evenings when she came home from work, her hands folded in her lap, staring off toward the old oak with the expression Maya had been too young to interpret. "Someday, baby girl," her mother had said once, "this old place is going to surprise us all." Maya had been maybe 7 at the time and had assumed her mother was talking about the garden she'd planned to plant, or maybe fixing up the cabin to look like the pretty houses in Maya's storybooks. Now, watching Rex's increasingly focused attention on that same area her mother used to contemplate, Maya wondered if there might have been more to those words than childhood wishful thinking. Dogs had senses humans didn't possess, she knew that much. Maybe Rex was detecting something she couldn't. Some change in the earth or a scent carried by the wind. The morning routine continued as it had for years. Maya would prepare for school while Rex patrolled their small domain. She'd share her Simple breakfast with him, usually toast or oatmeal, sometimes eggs when she could afford them. Then they'd walk together as far as the school boundary, where Rex would sit and watch until Maya disappeared through the front doors, returning home to wait for her afternoon return. Maya had learned to find contentment in these predictable rhythms. Even as she nurtured larger dreams, she read voraciously, checking out books from the library faster than most people her age could turn pages. History fascinated her, particularly stories of people who had overcome impossible odds to create better lives for themselves and their communities. She'd filled a notebook with quotes and ideas, planning for a future that felt both distant and urgently necessary. Education was her pathway out, she knew that much. Her grades were excellent, despite the challenges at home, and she'd already begun researching college scholarships available to students in her situation. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, had taken a special interest in Maya's academic potential, though even her encouragement came tinged with the sad recognition of how difficult Maya's path would be. As Maya prepared to leave for school that particular morning, she paused to study Rex once more. He was sitting in his usual spot near the oak tree, but his posture was different today, more alert, more excited. His tail thumped against the ground in a steady rhythm, and every few seconds he would lower his nose to the earth and inhale deeply, as if confirming something important. "What is it, boy?" Maya asked, walking over to stand beside him. "What do you think you found out here?" Rex looked up at her with bright, intelligent eyes, then back down at the ground. He pawed gently at the earth, not digging exactly, but indicating something specific about that particular spot. Maya knelt beside him and pressed her palm to the ground where his attention was focused. The soil felt different somehow, looser, as if it had been disturbed long ago and never quite settled back to its original state. A strange shiver ran through Maya, part excitement and part apprehension. She'd learned to trust Rex's instincts about most things, and his behavior suggested he'd detected something significant. But what could possibly be buried in her backyard that would capture such sustained interest? Standing and brushing the dirt from her hands, Maya made a mental note to investigate more thoroughly after school. Whatever Rex had found or thought he'd found would have to wait until she could give it proper attention. For now, she had algebra and history to focus on, and the familiar challenge of navigating another day in a world that seemed determined to remind her, at every turn, exactly where she belonged in its hierarchy. As they walked towards school, Rex's behavior returned to normal, though Maya caught him glancing back toward the yard several times, as if reluctant to leave whatever he'd discovered unattended. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows and promising another day of possibilities that Maya couldn't yet imagine. 3 days later, Maya returned from school to find Rex in a state she'd never seen before. Instead of his usual greeting at the front gate, he was behind the cabin, digging with an intensity that bordered on frantic. Dirt flew in steady arcs as his powerful paws worked the earth, and when Maya called his name, he barely lifted his head before returning to his excavation with renewed vigor. "Rex, what on earth are you doing?" Maya dropped her backpack and hurried toward him, concern overriding her curiosity. The hole he'd created was already knee-deep and growing by the minute. "Stop that right now. You're going to hurt yourself." But Rex continued digging, whining softly, as if trying to communicate something urgent. Maya had never seen him disobey a direct command, and his behavior sent a chill of worry through her chest. She knelt beside the hole and tried to pull him away from his work, but he gently resisted, looking at her with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. From across the yard, Harold Miller's voice carried over the fence with its familiar tone of disgust. "Now that mutt's tearing up what's left of the yard, probably burying garbage like the wild animal he is." Maya's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger, but she focused on Rex, who had resumed digging with even greater determination. "The The hole was now nearly as deep as Maya was tall, and she could see that Rex's paws were beginning to show signs of wear from the constant scratching against stone and packed earth. "Please, Rex," she whispered, trying a gentler approach. "Tell me, what's wrong? What do you think you found?" As if in response to her question, Rex's digging suddenly stopped. He stepped back from the hole, panting heavily, and looked at Maya with an expression that seemed almost triumphant. Then he lowered his head into the excavation and emerged with something clenched carefully between his teeth, something that definitely hadn't grown from the earth. Maya's heart skipped as Rex dropped the object at her feet. It was a piece of metal, tarnished and corroded, but clearly crafted rather than natural. The shape was irregular, curved on one side with what looked like decorative elements along the edge. Even covered in decades of dirt and oxidation, there was something deliberate about its form that made Maya's pulse quicken. "Where did this come from?" she breathed, picking up the metal piece and turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than she'd expected, with a weight that suggested substance beneath the surface corrosion. Rex whined again and returned to the hole, nosing around the bottom as if searching for more. Maya realized with growing amazement that there might indeed be more. Whatever this piece had come from, it clearly wasn't alone down there. Over the following days, Rex's obsession became the talk of the neighborhood, though not in ways that made Maya comfortable. The children who passed by her fence on their way to and from school began stopping to watch Rex's increasingly methodical excavation work, their commentary growing bolder and more cutting with each passing afternoon. "Look at the treasure dog," Kyle Foster announced one afternoon, his voice dripping with mock excitement, "digging up bottle caps and thinking he's found pirate gold." His friends laughed dutifully, and one of them picked up a small stone from the street and tossed it toward Rex, who ignored the projectile entirely as he continued his careful work. Maya had taken to sitting beside the hole after school, partly to keep Rex company and partly to protect him from the increasingly frequent harassment. "Maybe he's digging for bones," suggested Katie Mills, Harold Miller's niece, her voice carrying the same disdainful tone that seemed to run in the family. "Dead animal bones. That's probably what smells so bad over there." "Or maybe he's just crazy, like his owner," Kyle added. And this time, several of the gathered children laughed loudly enough that Maya was certain they intended for her to hear every word. Maya felt her face burn with familiar shame, but something new was stirring alongside the embarrassment, a growing determination that surprised her with its intensity. Rex had found something. She was increasingly certain of that. The metal piece was just the beginning, and despite the mockery from the neighborhood children, Maya found herself believing that whatever lay buried in her backyard might be genuinely significant. That evening, after the last of the children had been called home for dinner, Maya made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. She retrieved the old shovel from the shed behind the cabin, a tool so rusted and neglected that she'd never imagined it could still be functional. But as she hefted its weight and tested its edge against the hard-packed earth, she discovered that beneath the rust and corrosion lay steel that was still sound, still capable of the work it had been designed to do. The shovel felt right in her hands, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment to fulfill its purpose. Maya began to dig alongside Rex, working carefully around the edges of his excavation to expand the hole without destroying whatever lay beneath. The physical labor was harder than she'd expected, but there was something satisfying about the steady rhythm of lifting and moving earth, the gradual progress toward whatever truth was hidden below. As the hole grew deeper and wider, Maya began to find more pieces, fragments of metal that shared the same weight and mysterious craftsmanship as the first discovery. Some were larger, clearly parts of something that had once been whole. Others were smaller, delicate pieces that seemed almost jewelry-like in their careful construction. With each new discovery, Maya's excitement grew, but so did her caution. She began covering the excavation site with an old tarp each evening, weighting it down with stones to hide their progress from curious or malicious eyes. She moved their digging sessions to earlier morning hours when the neighborhood was still quiet, and she started a careful collection of everything they found, wrapping each piece in cloth and storing them in a wooden box beneath her bed. Rex seemed to understand the need for secrecy. He no longer dug during the day when Maya was at school, instead spending his time lying quietly beside the covered hole as if standing guard. But Maya could see the anticipation in his eyes, the barely contained energy that spoke of more discoveries waiting to be uncovered. The whispers and taunts from the neighborhood children continued, but they began to take on a different quality. As word spread about the crazy digging project behind Maya's cabin, some of the comments carried undertones of curiosity that the speakers probably didn't intend to reveal. "She's been at it for weeks now," Maya overheard Patricia Miller telling another neighbor. "That hole must be 6 feet deep by now. What could she possibly think she's going to find? Probably just wants attention," came the reply. "You know how these types are, always looking for some way to make themselves seem special." Maya absorbed these comments with growing confidence rather than shame. Let them think what they wanted to think. She and Rex knew better, and with each passing day, the evidence in her wooden box told a story that was becoming harder to dismiss as childish fantasy. The real breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon. When Maya had been digging for nearly 2 weeks, her shovel struck something that didn't give way, like packed earth or even buried stone. Instead, there was a hollow sound, metallic and unmistakably artificial. Rex immediately perked up, tail wagging, as he seemed to recognize that their persistence had finally paid off. Maya cleared the dirt away more carefully now, using her hands as much as the shovel to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. As the object began to emerge from its earthen hiding place, Maya found herself holding her breath. This wasn't another fragment or piece of something larger. This was clearly an intact object, deliberately buried and carefully protected. The afternoon sun slanted through the old oak tree as Maya finally freed the object completely from the earth. It was a box, small, intricately decorated, and undeniably valuable, even in its tarnished and dirt-covered state. The metal was different from the other pieces they'd found, darker but with hints of gold, showing through the surface corrosion. Maya lifted the box carefully, surprised by its weight. Something shifted inside when she moved it, confirming that it wasn't empty. Rex sat beside her, panting from the excitement of their shared discovery, his intelligent eyes fixed on the box, as if he too understood that this represented something far beyond their previous finds. With trembling fingers, Maya tried the clasp that held the box closed. It was corroded but not completely seized, and after several careful attempts, it finally gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet afternoon air. Maya lifted the lid and gasped at what lay inside. Nestled in what had once been rich fabric, now mostly deteriorated but still recognizable, were objects that could only be described as treasure. Coins that caught the light with unmistakable gleam, jewelry pieces with stones that winked like captured starlight, and documents wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth that had somehow survived decades buried in the earth. For a long moment, Maya could only stare at the contents of the box, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't costume jewelry or children's play treasure. Even her inexperienced eyes could recognize the weight and quality of genuine precious metals and stones. This was real, valuable, and somehow it had been buried in her backyard, waiting for Rex's determination and her own growing courage to bring it back to the light. Rex whined softly and nudged her arm, as if reminding her that their secret was still delicate and valuable. Maya carefully closed the box and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility settling around her shoulders like a mantle she'd never expected to wear. That night, Maya couldn't sleep. The treasure box sat hidden beneath her bed, its contents wrapped in every clean cloth she could find, but she felt as if it were glowing through the floorboards, broadcasting its presence to anyone who might be paying attention. She'd spent hours after dinner examining each piece under her bedside lamp, trying to make sense of what she'd inherited from the earth. The coins were the most mysterious elements of her discovery. They weren't like anything she'd seen in her limited experience with currency. Some bore dates from the 1800s, with inscriptions and imagery that spoke of a different era entirely. Others carried symbols she didn't recognize, though the weight and appearance suggested they were genuine precious metal rather than replicas or tokens. The jewelry pieces were equally puzzling and beautiful. A brooch with intricate filigree work surrounded what appeared to be genuine gemstones. Earrings that matched the brooch in style, suggesting they had once belonged to someone who valued elegance and quality. A ring with a stone so clear and bright that even Maya's untrained eye could recognize it as something beyond ordinary glass or crystal. But it was the documents that captured her imagination most completely. Wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow protected them from decades of moisture and decay. The papers were yellowed and fragile, but still legible. Most were written in a careful, educated hand, though the language was formal in a way that suggested they were much older than Maya had initially thought. One document appeared to be a map fragment, though what it depicted was unclear. The paper showed careful markings and notations with what looked like distance measurements and directional indicators. But the landmarks referenced were unfamiliar to Maya, and much of the writing was in a style that made it difficult to decipher, even though it was clearly English. The fragment showed only a portion of whatever larger map it had once been part of, but Maya could make out what looked like property boundaries, natural features like streams and rock formations, and several locations marked with symbols that could represent buildings or other significant sites. Most intriguingly, there were notations that seemed to indicate additional cache locations, suggesting that what she and Rex had found might be only the beginning of a much larger collection. Maya spread the map fragment carefully on her small desk, weighing down the corners with books to keep it flat without damaging the delicate paper. By lamplight, she tried to match the landmarks shown on the fragment to the actual geography of her property and the surrounding area. The old oak tree seemed to correspond to one of the marked features, and what might be the stream that ran behind the Henderson property appeared to match another reference point. If the map was accurate, and if Maya was interpreting it correctly, there might be at least 3 more burial sites within the boundaries of what was now her backyard and the immediate surrounding area. The possibility was both thrilling and overwhelming, raising questions about how such valuable items had come to be buried here, who had hidden them, and why they had remained undiscovered for so many decades. Sleep finally came in the early morning hours, filled with dreams of figures from another century, carefully burying treasures by moonlight, their faces obscured by shadows, but their urgency unmistakable. Maya woke feeling as if she'd witnessed something important, but couldn't quite grasp its full significance. Rex was already awake when Maya emerged from the cabin, pacing near their excavation site with the same focused energy that had driven his initial discovery. Maya quickly threw the tarp back over their work and spent several minutes making sure their digging wasn't visible to casual observation from neighboring yards. At school that day, Maya found it impossible to concentrate on her usual lessons. Her mind kept returning to the map fragment and its tantalizing suggestions of additional discoveries waiting beneath familiar ground. During her lunch break, instead of eating in the cafeteria where the other students' conversations reminded her too sharply of her outsider status, Maya made her way to the school library. The library was quiet and warm, with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows onto rows of books that seemed to hold all the world's knowledge. Maya had always found comfort here, but today she approached the reference section with a specific purpose that made her heart race with nervous excitement. The encyclopedia volumes were old and well-worn, their spines cracked from years of student research projects, but they contained exactly the type of historical information Maya needed. She pulled down several volumes dealing with American history, particularly focusing on the 19th century and the period following the Civil War. What she found made her discoveries take on new significance and complexity. The area where Maya lived had been part of the Underground Railroad network during the 1850s, with several documented safe houses and way stations for people fleeing slavery. After the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, many formerly enslaved families had settled in the region, often facing significant challenges in establishing secure homes and protecting whatever wealth they managed to accumulate. Maya read about the practice of burying valuable items during times of uncertainty, when banks were unreliable and legal protections for African American property rights were inconsistent or non-existent. Families would often hide their most precious possessions in carefully marked locations, planning to retrieve them when conditions became more stable and secure. The historical context made Maya's discoveries feel less like a fairy tale and more like a serious responsibility. If her property had indeed served as a hiding place for someone's carefully accumulated wealth, then the items she'd found weren't just valuable objects. They were family treasures, preserved through decades of uncertainty by someone who had hoped their descendants would eventually be able to reclaim them. Maya checked out several books on antique identification and historical metalwork, careful to vary her selections so that her research wouldn't appear suspicious to the librarian. She also found a book on treasure hunting that included chapters on proper documentation and authentication processes, information that seemed both practical and overwhelming given her current situation. The walk home from school felt different, now charged with new awareness of the historical significance that might be lying literally beneath her feet. Maya found herself looking at her neighborhood with fresh eyes, wondering what other secrets might be hidden in backyards that had been inhabited for over a century. Rex was waiting at the gate when Maya arrived home, and his enthusiasm was immediately apparent. He led her directly to their excavation site, where Maya could see that he'd been working despite her earlier instructions to wait for her return. The hole was noticeably deeper than it had been that morning, and Rex had clearly found something. Maya quickly retrieved her tools and joined Rex in expanding the excavation. Within minutes, her careful work was rewarded with the discovery of 2 more pieces that matched the style and apparent age of their previous finds. One was clearly part of a larger decorative item, possibly a serving piece or ceremonial object. The other was a coin, unlike any they'd found before, larger and heavier, with inscriptions that were partially legible despite decades of corrosion. As Maya cleaned the new coin carefully with an old toothbrush and water, she could make out a date, 1847. The discovery sent a chill through her as she realized that this treasure had been buried for more than a century and a half, waiting through decades of changing ownership and forgotten history until Rex's determination had finally brought it back to light. The afternoon's work yielded several more pieces, each adding to the growing collection that Maya was documenting. In a notebook, with careful sketches and descriptions, she'd learned enough from her library research to understand that proper documentation would be crucial if she ever decided to have the items professionally evaluated or authenticated. But with each new discovery, Maya also became more aware of the precarious nature of her situation. Word about their digging project was spreading through the neighborhood, and the comments from passing children and concerned adults were becoming increasingly pointed and suspicious. "What exactly are you looking for back there?" Martha Henderson asked one evening when she encountered Maya taking out her trash. Her tone was friendly but persistent, with an undertone that suggested genuine curiosity rather than idle gossip. "Just cleaning up the yard," Maya replied carefully. "Rex found some old junk buried back there, and I figured I should dig it all out rather than let him keep tearing up the grass." Mrs. Henderson nodded, but Maya could see that the explanation wasn't entirely satisfying. "Must be quite a lot of junk," to require such extensive excavation? I've been hearing the digging sounds for weeks now." Maya forced a casual shrug. "You know how it is with old properties. Previous owners probably buried all kinds of things back there instead of having them hauled away properly." The conversation ended pleasantly enough, but Maya felt the weight of increased scrutiny as she returned to the cabin. Rex seemed to sense her concern, staying close to her side and alerting to every sound from the neighboring yards with protective attention. That evening, as Maya catalogued their latest discoveries and compared them to the illustrations in her library books, she made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would continue the excavation, following the map fragment's guidance as best she could interpret it. But she would also begin researching proper channels for authentication and legal protection of whatever they found. The treasures belonged to someone, Maya realized, either to her by right of property ownership or to descendants of whoever had originally buried them. Either way, she had a responsibility to handle the discovery with the respect and care it deserved, regardless of what the neighbors might think or say about her efforts. Rex curled up beside her chair as Maya worked late into the evening, his presence a constant reminder that none of this would have been possible without his persistence and intuitive understanding that something significant lay hidden beneath their humble home. Together, they had uncovered not just treasure, but history, and Maya was determined to honor both with the dignity they deserved. Maya's trips to the library became a daily ritual, carefully planned to avoid drawing attention to her growing obsession with historical research. She would arrive during the quiet afternoon hours when most students had gone home, and before the evening crowd of adult patrons arrived for their weekly book browsing. The librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, no relation to the guidance counselor, had begun to notice Maya's consistent presence and specialized research focus. Unlike the suspicious curiosity Maya encountered from her neighbors, Mrs. Peterson's interest felt genuinely helpful and protective. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. "You're certainly developing quite an interest in local history," Mrs. Peterson observed one afternoon, as Maya returned a stack of books on antique identification and metallurgy. "Are you working on a special project for school?" Maya had prepared for this question, knowing that her research pattern would eventually attract notice. "I'm trying to learn more about the history of our neighborhood," she replied, which was truthful enough without revealing the full scope of her investigation. "My property is pretty old, and I'm curious about who might have lived there before us." Mrs. Peterson's face lit up with the genuine enthusiasm of someone whose passion for knowledge was rarely matched by her patron's curiosity. "How wonderful! Local history is so often overlooked, but it's full of fascinating stories. Have you looked at the county records? We have some historical documents in our special collection that might be helpful." Maya's pulse quickened. She hadn't known about any special collection, and the possibility of accessing primary historical documents felt like discovering another treasure entirely. "That would be amazing. I'd love to learn more about what you have available." Mrs. Peterson led Maya to a section of the library she'd never explored before, where older materials were stored in climate-controlled cases and filing cabinets. The collection was modest, but carefully preserved, containing property deeds, historical photographs, and personal documents donated by local families over the years. "Much of this material dates back to the mid-1800s, Mrs. Peterson explained, as she unlocked one of the filing cabinets. "We have some particularly interesting items related to the Underground Railroad activity in this area, and quite a bit of documentation from the Reconstruction period when many families were establishing new homes and communities." Maya tried to keep her expression neutral, but she felt as if Mrs. Peterson were describing exactly the historical context that might explain her backyard discoveries. "The Underground Railroad came through our area." "Oh yes, quite actively. Your street and the surrounding neighborhood were part of an established network of safe houses and way stations. Some of the families who settled here after the Civil War were formerly enslaved people who had traveled this route to freedom and decided to make permanent homes in the area. Mrs. Peterson pulled out a book Maya had never seen before, American Treasure Hunters, Lost Fortunes Found, by Dr. Marcus Webb, published by the University Historical Press. The cover was worn, but the content appeared comprehensive, with detailed chapters on authentication processes, historical treasure discoveries, and legal considerations for individuals who found valuable historical artifacts. "This might be particularly relevant to your research," Mrs. Peterson said, handing Maya the book. "Dr. Webb spent considerable time documenting treasure discoveries in our region, including several cases where valuable items were found buried on private property. His authentication guidelines are considered quite reliable." Maya accepted the book with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing that she was being offered exactly the resource she needed most. "Thank you so much. This looks perfect for what I'm trying to understand." "Keep it as long as you need," Mrs. Peterson added kindly. "And Maya, if you discover anything particularly interesting in your research, I'd love to hear about it. Local history deserves to be preserved and shared." Maya spent that evening absorbed in Dr. Webb's book, cross-referencing his descriptions and illustrations with the items she'd been carefully collecting. The matches were unmistakable and increasingly compelling. Several of the coins she'd found were described in Webb's chapters on Civil War era and Reconstruction period artifacts, with value estimates that made Maya's head spin. According to Webb's research, coins from the 1840s and 1850s in good condition could be worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars each, depending on their rarity and historical significance. The jewelry pieces, if they were genuine examples of period craftsmanship, might be worth even more to collectors and museums interested in preserving examples of 19th-century American decorative arts. But the book also contained warnings about the complexities of treasure authentication and the potential legal challenges that could arise when valuable historical artifacts were discovered on private property. Maya learned about the importance of establishing clear ownership rights, the need for professional appraisal and authentication, and the various ways that unscrupulous individuals might try to take advantage of inexperienced finders. The more Maya read, the more she realized that her discoveries represented both incredible opportunity and serious responsibility. If the items were as valuable as she was beginning to suspect, she would need professional help to handle them properly. But she would also need to be extremely careful about whom she trusted with that information. Rex's behavior over the following days confirmed Maya's growing sense that their initial discoveries were just the beginning. His digging had become more strategic and focused, as if he were following scent trails or some other sensory information that guided him to specific locations. Maya had learned to trust his instincts completely, and each spot where Rex showed sustained interest yielded additional artifacts. On a Saturday morning when the neighborhood was quiet and Maya felt safe working without observation, Rex led her to a location several feet from their original excavation site. His excitement was palpable as he began digging with renewed energy, and Maya quickly joined him with her faithful shovel and increasingly sophisticated collection of excavation tools. What they uncovered that morning dwarfed all their previous discoveries combined. Buried approximately 4 feet below the surface, carefully wrapped in oiled canvas that had somehow remained intact, was an ornate chest about the size of a large jewelry box. The metal was darkened with age but clearly decorative, with intricate engravings and what appeared to be genuine gemstones set into the surface design. Maya's hands shook as she carefully lifted the chest from its earthen hiding place. It was surprisingly heavy, and something substantial shifted inside when she moved it. This wasn't another collection of individual pieces. This was clearly a complete treasure cache, deliberately preserved and hidden by someone who had intended to return for it someday. The chest's latch was more complex than the simple clasp on their first discovery, but after several careful attempts, Maya managed to open it without damage. The contents took her breath away completely. Laid out in individual compartments were dozens of coins, pieces of jewelry that could only be described as heirlooms, and what appeared to be official documents wrapped in additional protective layers. Maya sat back on her heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was looking at. This wasn't just valuable, this was potentially life-changing wealth, the kind of discovery that appeared in newspaper headlines and history books. But with that realization came a flood of fear and uncertainty about how to proceed. She thought about the neighbors who had mocked her digging, the children who had thrown rocks at Rex, the adults who had whispered about her living situation. With a mixture of pity and disdain, how would they react when they learned what she'd been uncovering in her backyard? How could she protect both herself and her discoveries from people who might try to claim them or take advantage of her youth and inexperience? Rex seemed to sense her emotional turmoil. He sat quietly beside the open chest, his intelligent eyes moving between Maya's face and the treasure as if understanding the complexity of their situation. His presence was reassuring, but Maya knew that even Rex's loyalty and protection couldn't shield her from all the challenges that lay ahead. That evening, Maya returned to Dr. Webb's book with new urgency, focusing on the chapters that dealt with authentication processes and professional consultation. She found detailed information about treasure authentication services, including contact information for experts who specialized in historical American artifacts. One name appeared repeatedly throughout Webb's acknowledgments and recommended resources: Dr. Sarah Martinez of the American Historical Artifact Authentication Service. According to Webb's description, Dr. Martinez was known for her integrity, expertise, and sensitivity in working with individuals who had made significant historical discoveries. Maya copied Dr. Martinez's contact information into her notebook, along with detailed notes about the proper documentation and photography that would be required before any professional consultation could take place. She also noted Webb's advice about maintaining strict confidentiality during the initial stages of authentication, keeping discoveries private until legal ownership and value could be properly established. The decision to reach out for professional help felt both necessary and terrifying. Maya understood that once she contacted an expert, there would be no going back to the simple days when she and Rex could excavate their backyard in relative privacy. But she also realized that she had a responsibility to handle her discoveries properly, both for her own protection and out of respect for the historical significance of what she'd found. As Maya prepared for bed that night, she made a mental commitment to continue her research and documentation for another week before making any contact with outside experts. She wanted to be as prepared as possible for whatever process lay ahead, and she sensed that Rex might still have more discoveries to share with her before their private excavation phase came to an end. The wooden box under her bed now contained treasures that could potentially change not just her own life, but her understanding of her family's history and her place in the larger story of her community. Maya fell asleep, holding her mother's locket, wondering if Amelia had somehow known about the secrets buried beneath their humble home, and whether her cryptic words about the property surprising them someday had been more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. Maya spent 3 more days photographing and documenting every piece of her growing collection before finally gathering the courage to dial Dr. Sarah Martinez's number. Her hands were trembling as she waited through several rings, half hoping that no one would answer and she could postpone this momentous conversation for another day. American Historical Artifact Authentication Service, Dr. Martinez speaking. The voice was professional but warm, with a slight accent that suggested Spanish heritage. "Dr. Martinez, my name is Maya Johnson, and I think I might have found some historical artifacts on my property. I got your contact information from Dr. Webb's book on treasure hunting, and I was hoping you might be able to help me understand what I've discovered." There was a brief pause. Then Dr. Martinez's voice took on a more focused quality. "I see. Can you tell me a bit more about what you found and the circumstances of the discovery?" Maya had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times, but actually speaking the words felt surreal. "I live on property that's been in my family for several years, and my dog started digging in the backyard about a month ago. We've found coins, jewelry, and some documents that appear to be quite old, possibly from the 1800s. That's certainly intriguing. Are you able to send me some digital photographs of the items for an initial assessment? I should mention that my consultation services do require payment, but I offer reduced rates for young people and for discoveries with significant historical importance." Maya felt a wave of relief at Dr. Martinez's straightforward professional approach. "I've been documenting everything very carefully, and I can send photographs. I should probably mention that I'm only 12, so I'll need to handle this process somewhat differently than an adult might." Another pause, longer this time. "I appreciate your honesty about your age, Maya. That does add some complexity to the situation, but it doesn't prevent us from proceeding appropriately. Do you have a parent or guardian who can be involved in this process?" Maya's throat tightened. This was the question she'd been dreading. "I live alone with my dog. My mother passed away several years ago, and I don't have other family in the area." Dr. Martinez's voice became noticeably gentler. "I see. That does require some additional consideration for both legal and practical reasons. Let me suggest this. Send me the photographs you've prepared, along with any documentation about the discovery location and circumstances. I'll provide you with an initial assessment at no charge, and we can discuss how to proceed in a way that protects both your interests and the historical value of your discoveries." The call ended with Maya feeling both excited and apprehensive about what she'd set in motion. Dr. Martinez had seemed genuinely interested in helping rather than taking advantage, but Maya was still acutely aware of her vulnerability as a minor, dealing with potentially valuable property. Maya spent that evening preparing a comprehensive email to Dr. Martinez, including detailed photographs of every item and careful descriptions of the excavation process and discovery locations. She also included photographs of the map fragment and her documentation of the historical research she'd conducted. The response came faster than Maya had expected. Dr. Martinez replied within 2 days, and her message was both exciting and concerning. According to her initial assessment, Maya's discoveries appeared to be genuine historical artifacts with potentially significant value. Several of the coins were rare enough to warrant immediate professional authentication, and the jewelry pieces showed craftsmanship consistent with high-quality 19th-century American work. But Dr. Martinez's message also included warnings about the attention that such discoveries typically attracted, and advice about maintaining confidentiality until proper legal and insurance protections could be established. She recommended that Maya avoid discussing her findings with neighbors or community members until the authentication process was complete. Maya realized with growing concern that this advice might have come too late. Despite her efforts at discretion, word about her excavation project had been spreading through the neighborhood for weeks. She'd noticed changes in how people looked at her when she walked to school, and several neighbors who had never shown interest in her existence were suddenly making efforts to strike up conversations. The situation became undeniably public when Maya discovered a small article in the local newspaper, the Weekly Herald, tucked away on page 3 of the community events section. The headline read, Unusual activity reported at local residents, and while the article didn't mention Maya by name, it clearly referred to extensive excavation work being conducted by a minor resident and included speculation about what might be motivating such sustained digging efforts. Maya stared at the newspaper article with a mixture of anger and anxiety. Someone had contacted the paper about her activities, turning her private discovery into community gossip. The article was brief and presented more as a curiosity than serious news, but Maya understood that this represented a fundamental change in her situation. The changes in her neighbor's behavior became pronounced almost immediately after the newspaper article appeared. Kyle Foster, who had spent weeks mocking Maya's treasure hunting, suddenly appeared at her fence one afternoon, with what he clearly intended to be a friendly smile. "Hey, Maya!" he called out, his voice carrying a false warmth that made Maya's skin crawl. "I heard you've been finding some really interesting stuff back there. That's so cool. Maybe we could help you dig sometime." Maya looked at Kyle with the steady, measuring gaze she'd learned to use when adults tried to manipulate her. "I appreciate the offer, but Rex and I have our system pretty well figured out." Kyle's smile became more forced. "Well, if you find anything really valuable, you're going to need help figuring out what to do with it. My dad knows people who could help you get the best prices for old stuff." "I'll keep that in mind," Maya replied evenly, though she had no intention of involving James Foster or his connections in her discoveries. She'd heard enough of Mr. Foster's opinions about her living situation to know exactly what kind of help he might provide. Rex had been standing silently beside Maya during this conversation, but she noticed that his posture was more alert and protective than usual. He seemed to share her instinctive distrust of Kyle's sudden friendliness, and his presence provided comfort as well as deterrent effect. Similar encounters began occurring with increasing frequency. Patricia Miller, who had spent years crossing the street to avoid walking past Maya's property, suddenly developed an interest in discussing Maya's gardening projects. Harold Miller started making comments about how industrious Maya was and how impressive it was to see such dedication to property improvement from someone so young. The false kindness was more unsettling than the previous hostility had been. Maya understood that mockery and disdain were honest expressions of how these people truly felt about her. But the new attention was calculating and opportunistic, driven by speculation about what benefits they might gain from associating with her discoveries. Maya found genuine refuge in her conversations with Mrs. Eleanor Peterson at the library, who seemed to be the only adult in her life offering help without obvious ulterior motives. Mrs. Peterson had noticed the newspaper article and approached Maya with characteristic directness and concern. "I saw the piece in the Herald about excavation work in your neighborhood," Mrs. Peterson said during one of Maya's afternoon visits. "I hope you're being careful about protecting whatever you might have found, dear. Sometimes when people think there's money involved, they don't always have your best interests at heart." Maya appreciated Mrs. Peterson's tactful way of offering support without prying into details. "I'm trying to be very careful about who I trust and how I handle everything. It's more complicated than I expected it to be. I imagine it would be. And Maya, I hope you know that if you need someone to serve as an adult advocate or witness for any legal processes, I'd be happy to help. I've been a librarian in this community for 35 years, and I've seen how young people can be taken advantage of when they don't have proper support." The offer moved Maya more deeply than she could easily express. Mrs. Peterson's willingness to serve as an advocate felt like the first genuinely altruistic assistance she'd been offered since her discoveries began attracting attention. Meanwhile, Rex's protective instincts had intensified noticeably as strangers began appearing near their property with increasing frequency. Maya had begun noticing unfamiliar cars driving slowly past her house, and several times she'd caught people standing at her fence, clearly trying to see into her backyard where the excavation work was taking place. Rex now positioned himself, strategically whenever Maya was outside, maintaining visual contact with her while keeping watch on the street and neighboring properties. His alert, protective presence had become even more important as Maya navigated the growing complexity of her situation. Dr. Martinez's subsequent communications included specific warnings about exactly the kind of attention Maya was now experiencing. According to her email, significant treasure discoveries often attracted treasure hunters, opportunists, and individuals with questionable motives who would attempt to involve themselves in the authentication and recovery process for personal gain. Maya realized that maintaining control over her discoveries would require more wisdom and determination than she'd initially understood. The newspaper article had marked the end of her private excavation period and the beginning of a much more complicated phase where every decision would have far-reaching consequences for both her immediate safety and her long-term future. As Maya prepared for what she sensed would be the final phase of her backyard excavation, she made a commitment to trust her instincts about people's motivations and to rely primarily on Rex's intuitive understanding of who could be trusted. The treasure beneath her property was becoming secondary to the more complex treasure of learning to navigate a world where her newfound potential wealth made her both more valuable and more vulnerable than she'd ever been before. That evening, as Maya documented her latest discoveries and prepared for another day of managing increased attention from her community, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since Rex first began his determined digging. The girl who had once been invisible to her neighbors was now the center of speculation and false friendship, and Maya was learning that being noticed wasn't necessarily an improvement over being ignored. Dr. Martinez's follow-up call came on a Thursday afternoon when Maya was sitting on her front steps, trying to find a quiet moment away from the increasingly frequent interruptions from curious neighbors. The conversation that followed changed everything Maya thought she understood about her situation. "Maya, I've completed my initial analysis of the photographs and documentation you sent," Dr. Martinez began, her voice carrying a gravity that made Maya's pulse quicken. "What you've discovered appears to be a historically significant collection with extraordinary monetary value. Based on the preliminary authentication markers I can identify, you're looking at artifacts that could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more." Maya felt the world tilt slightly around her. Hundreds of thousands of dollars was wealth beyond anything she'd ever imagined, the kind of money that existed in completely different universe from her reality of carefully budgeted utilities and occasional hunger. "However," Dr. Martinez continued, "discoveries of this magnitude typically involve complex legal considerations regarding ownership rights, historical significance, and proper handling procedures. Before we proceed with formal authentication, you need to establish clear legal ownership of both the property and anything found on it." Maya's throat felt dry as she asked, "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we need documentation proving that you or your family legally own the land where the artifacts were discovered. Without clear property ownership, there could be challenges to your right to keep whatever you found. Do you have access to property deeds, ownership documents, or estate papers from when your mother acquired the land?" Maya realized with growing alarm that she'd never thought to look for such documents. Her mother's death had been followed by such confusion and upheaval that Maya had focused entirely on immediate survival rather than understanding the legal aspects of her living situation. I'm not sure what papers my mother had," Maya admitted. "I was only 9 when she died, and I never looked through her documents. I just knew we owned the house because she always said it was ours." "That's understandable, given your age when you lost her. But Maya, this is crucial. Without proof of ownership, other parties could potentially claim rights to your discoveries. I strongly recommend that you locate and review any legal documents your mother may have left. And frankly, Given the value involved here, you should consider consulting with an attorney who can help protect your interests." After the call ended, Maya sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Dr. Martinez had revealed. The numbers were almost incomprehensible, hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more. But even more concerning was the suggestion that she might not have legal rights to her own discoveries. Maya spent that evening searching through her mother's belongings, many of which she hadn't disturbed since Amelia's death 3 years earlier. In a wooden box at the back of her mother's bedroom closet, beneath old photographs and letters, Maya found a manila envelope marked "Important Papers" in her mother's careful handwriting. Inside the envelope, Maya discovered documents that told a story she'd never fully understood. The property deed was there, clearly showing that Amelia Johnson had purchased the land and cabin outright in 2018, just 2 years before her death. But there were other papers as well. A will that designated Maya as Amelia's sole heir, and estate documents that had been filed with the county after her mother's death. The legal document that proved most significant was the property deed itself, which showed not only that Amelia had owned the land legally, but that ownership had been properly transferred to Maya through the estate settlement process. According to the paperwork, Maya was the legitimate owner of the property and everything on it, despite her youth and current living situation. Maya felt a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety as she realized that she did have legal rights to her discoveries, but she also understood that these documents would now make her situation even more complicated. If word leaked about the potential value of what she'd found, the legal proof of ownership might attract even more unwanted attention from people hoping to benefit from her discoveries. The next morning brought a confrontation that confirmed Maya's growing concerns about her neighbors' changing attitudes. James Foster appeared at her front gate, wearing what Maya recognized as his official business expression, the same one he used when addressing town council meetings. "Maya, I've been hearing some interesting rumors about your excavation project," he said without preamble. "As someone who's been watching out for your welfare since your mother's passing, I think it's time we had a serious conversation about what you're doing back there." Maya felt a flash of anger at his casual rewriting of history. James Foster had never shown the slightest concern for her welfare, and his current interest was obviously motivated by speculation about potential profits rather than genuine care. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Foster, but I'm handling my property maintenance just fine," Maya replied evenly. "Now, Maya, let's be realistic here. If you've actually found something valuable, and I'm not saying you have, but if you have, you're going to need adult guidance to handle it properly. These kinds of situations require expertise in legal matters, tax implications, proper valuation procedures. You can't possibly manage all of that on your own." Maya studied James Foster's face, noting the way his eyes kept darting toward her backyard and the barely concealed excitement in his voice when he mentioned valuable discoveries. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Foster?" "Well, I'd be happy to help you navigate the legal and financial aspects of whatever you might have found. Naturally, anyone providing that kind of professional assistance would expect reasonable compensation for their time and expertise, but I'd make sure you were treated fairly throughout the process." Maya felt a cold certainty that James Foster's definition of fair treatment would heavily favor his own interests over hers. "That's very kind of you to offer, but I'm already working with professional consultants who specialize in this type of situation." The pleasant mask slipped from Foster's face for just a moment, revealing the calculation beneath his concern. "I see. Well, Maya, I hope you understand that discoveries of historical significance on residential property can sometimes raise questions about proper permits, environmental considerations, tax obligations. The town has legitimate interests in making sure everything is handled appropriately." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Maya realized that James Foster was prepared to use his position on the town council to create problems for her if she didn't include him in whatever profits her discoveries might generate. Rex had been lying quietly beside Maya during this conversation, but she noticed that his posture had gradually shifted to a more alert and protective stance. When James Foster took a step closer to the gate, Rex stood smoothly and moved to position himself between Maya and the adult, his intelligent eyes never leaving Foster's face. "I understand your position, Mr. Foster," Maya said carefully. "I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that I'm handling everything through proper legal channels and professional consultants. There won't be any reason for town council involvement." After Foster left, Maya felt the weight of the challenges ahead settling more heavily on her shoulders. It was becoming clear that her discoveries had created a situation where everyone around her had opinions about how she should proceed, and most of those opinions seemed designed to benefit the advice givers rather than Maya herself. Maya's salvation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson arrived that afternoon with a visitor, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a straightforward manner that immediately reminded Maya of the librarian herself. "Maya, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Jennifer Peterson Walsh," Mrs. Peterson said. "Jennifer is an attorney who specializes in property law and estate issues. I told her about your situation, and she offered to provide some pro bono consultation to make sure your rights are properly protected." Jennifer Peterson Walsh extended her hand with a professional smile that seemed genuine rather than calculating. "Hello, Maya. My mother tells me you've found yourself in a complex situation that requires some legal guidance. I'd be happy to review your documents and help you understand your options." Maya felt a wave of relief at finally meeting an adult who seemed interested in helping without expecting anything in return. "That would be wonderful. I have to admit, I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed by all the legal aspects of this situation." Jennifer spent an hour reviewing Maya's property documents and listening to her description of the discoveries and the attention they'd been attracting. Her assessment was both reassuring and sobering. "The good news is that you have clear legal ownership of the property and anything found on it," Jennifer explained. "The documents your mother left are properly executed and filed. But Maya, once word gets out about the potential value of your discoveries, you're going to face pressure from many directions. People will try to insert themselves into your situation, claiming they can help you when they're really trying to help themselves." Maya nodded, thinking of James Foster's thinly veiled threats and Kyle Foster's sudden friendliness. "I'm already starting to see that. What you need is a clear plan for handling the authentication and valuation process in a way that protects your interests and maintains your control over the situation. You also need to understand your tax obligations and consider proper insurance coverage for valuable items." Jennifer's practical, straightforward approach felt like exactly what Maya needed. Unlike the neighbors who suddenly wanted to be involved in her discoveries, Jennifer was focused on helping Maya navigate the process independently rather than making herself indispensable to the outcome. Rex seemed to approve of Jennifer as well, accepting her presence without the watchful tension he'd shown around other adults who'd taken interest in Maya's situation. His calm acceptance felt like an important endorsement, given how reliable his instincts had proven throughout this entire experience. As Maya prepared for bed that evening, she reflected on how dramatically the stakes had changed. What had begun as a curious excavation project had become a situation involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, legal complexities, and community pressures she'd never anticipated. But she also felt more prepared to handle the challenges ahead. With Dr. Martinez providing authentication expertise, Jennifer Peterson Walsh offering legal guidance, and Mrs. Peterson serving as a trusted advocate, Maya finally had a support system that seemed focused on her best interests rather than their own potential gains. Rex curled up beside her bed as Maya organized the legal documents that proved her ownership rights. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they moved toward formal authentication of her discoveries. But tonight, Maya felt more confident about her ability to protect both her treasures and her own future. The property deed lay on her nightstand, a simple document that represented her connection to this land and her right to whatever secrets it had kept hidden for so many decades. Maya fell asleep holding her mother's locket, wondering if Amelia had somehow known that this old property would someday provide the security and opportunity that had eluded them during her lifetime. The revelation came while Maya was organizing her mother's papers for Jennifer Peterson Walsh's review. Tucked behind the property deed in the manila envelope was something Maya had overlooked in her initial search, an old Bible with a leather cover so worn and cracked that it barely held together. Maya handled the Bible carefully, recognizing it as something that had been treasured by her mother despite Amelia's infrequent church attendance. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with the careful annotations and underlinings that spoke of genuine study and reflection. But it was the family record section, handwritten on the dedicated pages at the front of the Bible, that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. In faded ink, written in several different hands across what appeared to be many decades, was a family tree that told a story Maya had never known. The earliest entry was dated 1863, and recorded the marriage of Isaiah Johnson, born into bondage 1838, granted freedom 1863, to Rebecca Thompson, born free Philadelphia 1845. Maya traced the careful entries with her finger, following the genealogy down through the generations. Isaiah and Rebecca had settled in Maya's area in 1867, purchasing land during the Reconstruction period, when opportunities for land ownership briefly opened to formerly enslaved families. Their son, Josiah Johnson, had been Maya's great-great-grandfather. But it was the notation beside Josiah's entry that made Maya's hands tremble. In careful script, someone had written, "Protected family treasures during troubled times, 1877-1885. Items secured on property for future generations. Map and record. Kept safe." Maya stared at the words, her mind racing as the full significance became clear. The treasures she and Rex had been uncovering weren't random artifacts buried by unknown people. They were her own family's valuables, hidden by her ancestor during the dangerous period when Reconstruction ended, and conditions for African-American families became increasingly perilous. Maya carefully turned more pages, discovering additional family records and personal notes that filled in details of the story. Josiah Johnson had accumulated considerable wealth through hard work and careful saving during the brief period when economic opportunities existed for formerly enslaved people. But as federal protections were withdrawn and local hostility increased, he had made the decision to hide the family's most valuable possessions rather than risk losing everything to theft or violence. The Bible contained a detailed record of what had been buried, coins saved over years, jewelry that had been wedding gifts and family heirlooms, and documents proving property ownership and financial accounts. Josiah had created multiple cache locations across the property, marking them carefully on maps that he intended to pass down to his children. But tragedy had intervened. According to the family records, Josiah had died unexpectedly in 1888, apparently, before he could share the location information with his surviving family. His widow and children had searched for the buried treasures, but had never found them, eventually giving up hope and focusing on survival through increasingly difficult times. The property had remained in the Johnson family through several generations, passing down through a combination of inheritance and determination, despite numerous challenges and attempts by others to claim it. Maya's great-grandfather had held onto the land during the Depression. Her grandfather had protected it during the 1950s and 1960s, and her mother had managed to maintain ownership even as a single parent facing her own economic struggles. Maya realized with overwhelming emotion that she was the culmination of her ancestors' hope. Josiah Johnson had hidden his family's treasures during a time of uncertainty, trusting that future generations would someday be able to reclaim what rightfully belonged to them. Rex's instinctive digging had finally fulfilled a promise that had waited over 130 years to be kept. The family Bible also contained personal letters and documents that provided context for the historical period during which the treasures had been hidden. Maya read accounts of increasing violence and intimidation directed at successful African-American families, of property being seized through legal technicalities and outright theft, of the economic gains made during early Reconstruction being systematically stripped away. Josiah's decision to bury the family wealth emerged as an act of both hope and practical wisdom. He had understood that visible prosperity made his family a target, but he had also believed that conditions would eventually improve enough for his descendants to safely reclaim their inheritance. Maya spent hours reading through the Bible's family records, discovering stories of resilience and determination that connected her current situation to a much larger narrative of survival and persistence. Her great-great-grandfather had faced challenges that made her own struggles seem small by comparison, yet he had maintained hope for a future he would never see. When Jennifer Peterson Walsh arrived the next day to review Maya's legal documents, the family Bible provided crucial additional evidence of Maya's ownership rights. Not only did she legally own the property where the treasures had been found, but she was also the direct descendant of the person who had originally hidden them. This is extraordinary, Jennifer said as she carefully examined the Bible's family records. This documentation establishes not just legal ownership, but historical provenance. These artifacts aren't just valuable objects, they're family heirlooms. With documented heritage, that significantly strengthens your legal position. Jennifer explained that the family connection would also influence how the treasures were valued and taxed. Items that could be proven to be family inheritances were treated differently under tax law than treasures with no established provenance. The Bible's records would be crucial evidence in any legal proceedings. Dr. Martinez's reaction to the family Bible discovery was equally enthusiastic. When Maya sent her photographs of the family records and documentation, her response was immediate and excited. "Maya, this transforms everything about your discovery," Dr. Martinez wrote in her email. "What you found isn't just historically significant. It's a documented example of how African-American families protected their wealth during one of the most challenging periods in American history. Museums and historians will be incredibly interested in this story." The revelation about her family's history had an unexpected effect on Maya's sense of herself and her place in the community. For years, she had carried a quiet shame about her circumstances, accepting the implicit message from neighbors and classmates that her poverty and isolation reflected some personal failing or unworthiness. But learning about Josiah Johnson's struggles and determination, his success in accumulating wealth, and his wisdom in protecting it, gave Maya a completely different framework for understanding her own situation. She wasn't the descendant of failure or inadequacy. She was the heir to a legacy of resilience and hope that had survived more than a century of challenges. Rex seemed to sense the emotional significance of Maya's discoveries about her family history. He had been more attentive and protective than usual, while Maya spent hours reading through the Bible, as if he understood that something important was happening. When Maya sat outside reading the family records aloud to him, Rex would lie quietly beside her, occasionally placing his head on her lap in what felt like comfort or encouragement. Word about the family connection spread through the community. Quickly, once Maya shared the story with Mrs. Peterson and Jennifer Peterson Walsh, the narrative of a young girl discovering her ancestors' hidden treasures captured imaginations in a way that simple treasure hunting never could have. The local newspaper ran a much larger story about Maya's discoveries once the family angle became known. The headline, Local girl discovers family treasures hidden during reconstruction appeared on the front page, complete with photographs of Maya and Rex beside their excavation site and quotes from Dr. Martinez about the historical significance of the discovery. The newspaper article brought both positive and negative attention from the wider community. Some people expressed genuine excitement about the historical importance of Maya's discoveries and admiration for her ancestors' foresight. Others seemed resentful that someone they had dismissed and looked down upon had turned out to be the rightful heir to significant wealth. Maya found herself becoming something of a local celebrity, with reporters from regional newspapers and television stations requesting interviews about her story. The attention was overwhelming and sometimes uncomfortable, but Maya also recognized it as an opportunity to control the narrative about her discoveries and her family's history. In interviews, Maya spoke eloquently about her ancestors' courage and wisdom, about the importance of understanding local African American history, and about her plans to use her inheritance responsibly. She deflected questions about the specific value of her discoveries, while emphasizing the emotional and historical significance of reclaiming her family's legacy. The media attention also brought unexpected support from people who had never taken notice of Maya before. African American families from the surrounding area reached out to share their own stories of ancestors who had faced similar challenges during Reconstruction and beyond. Historians and museum professionals expressed interest in helping Maya preserve and share her family's story. Maya began to understand that her discoveries represented more than personal wealth. They were part of a larger historical narrative about African American resilience and survival that deserved to be told and remembered. The treasures that Josiah Johnson had hidden in hope were now helping to illuminate a period of history that was often overlooked or misunderstood. As Maya stood in her backyard one evening, looking at the site where Rex had first begun digging, she felt a profound connection to the great-great-grandfather she had never known. Josiah Johnson had buried these treasures during a time of uncertainty and danger, trusting that someday his descendants would be able to reclaim what belonged to them. Maya realized that she had been chosen not just to find the treasures, but to carry forward the legacy of hope and determination that they represented. The girl, who had once been ashamed of her circumstances, was now proud to be the descendant of someone who had faced far greater challenges with courage and wisdom. Rex sat beside her as Maya contemplated the responsibility that came with her inheritance. The treasures would provide financial security that she had never imagined possible. But more importantly, they had given her a story of family strength and perseverance that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Maya made a quiet promise to her ancestor that she would honor his legacy by using her inheritance wisely and sharing his story with respect and dignity. Josiah Johnson's hope for future generations had finally been fulfilled, and Maya was determined to prove worthy of the trust he had placed in descendants he would never meet, but had never stopped believing in. The final authentication process required Maya to work directly with officials from the U.S. Treasury Department's Historical Assets Division, a development that transformed her backyard discovery into a matter of national historical significance. Dr. Martinez had arranged for the federal involvement after her preliminary analysis confirmed that several of Maya's coins were rare enough to warrant government attention. Maya stood in her living room on a crisp October morning, watching through her front window as black government vehicles pulled up to her modest cabin. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit that her mother had bought for special occasions, and her mother's locket hung around her neck like a talisman, connecting her to family strength across generations. Rex stood beside her, his posture alert but calm. Over the months since their first discovery, he had grown accustomed to strangers visiting their property, though Maya noticed that he still evaluated each newcomer with careful attention before deciding whether they could be trusted. The treasury. Officials were led by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and the composed manner of someone accustomed to handling historically significant discoveries. She was accompanied by 2 authentication specialists and a documentation expert whose job was to create official records of every item in Maya's collection. "Miss Johnson," Dr. Hendricks said, as Maya opened her front door. "I'm Dr. Patricia Hendricks from the Treasury Department's Historical Assets Division. Dr. Martinez has briefed us on your discoveries, and we're here to conduct the final authentication process that will determine the official value and historical classification of your family's artifacts." Maya invited the officials inside, acutely aware of her humble surroundings, but no longer ashamed of them. The months of dealing with increased attention and media interest had taught her that dignity came from how she carried herself rather than from the elegance of her home's furnishings. The authentication process was meticulous and fascinating. Dr. Hendricks and her team examined each item with precision instruments and documented everything with professional photography and detailed written descriptions. Maya watched as experts who had devoted their careers to understanding historical artifacts confirmed what she had suspected from the beginning. Her great-great-grandfather's hidden treasures were genuine, rare, and extraordinarily valuable. "Miss Johnson," Dr. Hendricks said during a break in the evaluation process, "I want you to understand that what your ancestor accomplished was remarkable. Josiah Johnson managed to acquire and preserve a collection that represents one of the most significant examples of African-American wealth accumulation during the Reconstruction period that we've ever documented." Maya felt a surge of pride for the ancestor she had never known. He was protecting his family's future, wasn't he? He knew that things were getting dangerous for successful black families, so he hid everything, hoping that someday it would be safe for us to have it back. Exactly. And the fact that this collection remained hidden and intact for over 130 years is almost unprecedented. Your discovery provides historians with invaluable insight into how families navigated the economic and social challenges of that period. The preliminary valuation figures that Dr. Hendricks shared with Maya were staggering. The collection's total worth was estimated at approximately $150 million, making it one of the largest private treasure discoveries in recent American history. The figure was so far beyond Maya's comprehension that she had to ask Dr. Hendricks to repeat it several times before it began to feel real. $150 million, Dr. Hendricks confirmed, her voice gentle as she recognized Maya's shock. The coins alone account for approximately 60 million, given their rarity and historical significance. The jewelry and decorative items add another 40 million. But the real value drivers are the historical documents and the provenance provided by your family Bible. Complete collections with documented heritage are extremely rare. Maya sat in stunned silence, trying to process numbers that represented more wealth than everyone in her neighborhood combined would earn in their lifetimes. Rex seemed to sense her emotional state and moved closer to her chair, providing the comfort of his steady presence during this overwhelming moment. The authentication process took 3 full days, during which Maya's property was cordoned off and protected by security personnel who ensured that the valuable artifacts remained safe during evaluation. The presence of federal officials and security guards created intense curiosity throughout the neighborhood, with crowds of onlookers gathering at a respectful distance to witness the historic proceedings. Maya watched from her front porch as neighbors who had spent years ignoring or dismissing her now stood in clusters, whispering among themselves and pointing toward her property. The contrast between their current attention and their previous indifference wasn't lost on her, though Maya found that she felt more sadness than satisfaction at the irony. James Foster made several attempts to insert himself into the proceedings. appearing at Maya's gate with offers of community support and suggestions about how the discovery might benefit local economic development. Maya politely but firmly declined his involvement, recognizing his transparent attempts to associate himself with her newfound importance. "Maya," he said during one of his more persistent visits, "you need to think about your responsibilities. To the community that raised you, this kind of windfall could transform our entire town if it's handled properly." Maya looked at James Foster with the steady gaze she had learned to use when adults tried to manipulate her. "Mr. Foster, I don't recall the community raising me. I've been pretty much raising myself for the past 3 years. But you're right that I have responsibilities, and I plan to meet them thoughtfully." Kyle Foster, who had spent months mocking Maya's treasure hunting, now appeared at her fence with his friends, their previous derision replaced by obvious envy and desperate attempts to claim past friendship. "Hey Maya," Kyle called out, "remember how I always said you were going to find something amazing back there? I totally believed in you from the beginning." Maya exchanged a look with Rex, who seemed to share her amusement at Kyle's transparent revision of history. "I remember your support very differently, Kyle, but I appreciate you stopping by." The neighborhood's changed attitude toward Maya was complex and sometimes uncomfortable. People who had crossed the street to avoid her now waved enthusiastically when they saw her walking to school. Families who had never acknowledged her existence suddenly discovered urgent reasons to have conversations near her fence. The transformation felt hollow and opportunistic, though Maya tried to respond with grace rather than bitterness. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson and her daughter Jennifer remained Maya's most trusted advisors throughout the authentication process, helping her navigate both the legal complexities and the social pressures that accompanied her newfound wealth. Their consistent support felt genuine, in contrast to the calculated friendliness Maya encountered from other community members. "Maya," Jennifer said during one of their planning sessions, "you're going to need to make some important decisions about how you want to handle your wealth and your relationships with people in this community. Some of the attention you're receiving is sincere, but much of it is motivated by hope for personal benefit." Maya had been thinking about exactly those issues as she watched her neighbor's behavior evolve. "I want to help people, and I want to honor my ancestors' legacy, but I also want to make sure I'm helping for the right reasons and helping the right people." The weeks leading up to the final authentication ceremony gave Maya time to reflect on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. Less than 6 months earlier, she had been an invisible girl living in a dilapidated cabin, dismissed by her neighbors and struggling to meet her basic needs. Now she was the center of national media attention, the heir to a historically significant fortune and a symbol of family perseverance across generations. Maya spent hours sitting in her backyard with Rex, looking at the sites where they had made their discoveries and thinking about the responsibility that came with her inheritance. The money would provide security beyond her wildest dreams, but it also represented a trust from her ancestor that required wisdom and careful stewardship. Rex had remained her constant companion throughout the authentication process, seeming to understand that his role as protector and friend had become even more important as Maya navigated unprecedented attention and pressure. His calm presence provided stability during moments when the magnitude of her situation threatened to overwhelm her. Maya began developing plans for how she would use her wealth, guided by conversations with Jennifer Peterson Walsh about responsible management and by her own growing understanding of her community's needs. She wanted to honor Josiah Johnson's sacrifice by using his preserved wealth to create opportunities and improvements that would benefit not just herself, but future generations of families who faced challenges similar to those her ancestor had overcome. The final authentication ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, when Dr. Hendricks would present Maya with the official validation certificate confirming her collection's value at $150 million and documenting her legal ownership of every item. Local and regional media had been invited to witness the historic moment, and Maya had prepared remarks about her ancestors' legacy and her plans for responsible stewardship of his preserved wealth. The night before the ceremony, Maya sat on her front steps with Rex, looking out at the neighborhood that had shaped her childhood and early adolescence. Tomorrow would mark the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another that she could barely imagine. "What do you think, Rex?" she asked quietly, scratching behind his ears as he leaned against her shoulder. "Are we ready for all this to change?" Rex looked at her with intelligent eyes that seemed to convey understanding and support. He had been with her through the hardest days of loneliness and struggle, and Maya knew he would remain beside her as she navigated the complexities that came with unprecedented wealth and opportunity. Maya fell asleep that night, holding her mother's locket and thinking about the chain of hope that connected her to Josiah Johnson across more than a century. Tomorrow, she would officially become one of the wealthiest young people in the country, but tonight she was still just a girl who had learned to find treasure in the love of a loyal dog and the wisdom of ancestors she was only beginning to understand. The validation certificate that would document her inheritance represented more than monetary wealth. It was proof that hope and determination could survive across generations, that careful planning and sacrifice could eventually bear fruit, and that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come from the most humble beginnings. Maya was ready to prove herself worthy of the trust that Josiah Johnson had placed in descendants he would never meet but had never stopped believing in. The October afternoon was crisp and clear when Dr. Patricia Hendricks stepped up to the microphone that had been set up in Maya's front yard. A crowd of nearly 200 people had gathered, neighbors, media representatives, local officials, and curious onlookers who had driven from surrounding towns to witness what the regional news had described as the most significant treasure discovery in modern American history. Maya stood beside Dr. Hendricks, wearing her navy blue dress and her mother's locket, with Rex positioned protectively at her side. In Dr. Hendricks's hands was a leather portfolio containing the official validation certificate from the U.S. Treasury Department, along with the golden medallion that had emerged as the single most valuable item in Josiah Johnson's preserved collection. The medallion itself was extraordinary. A large circular piece of gold with intricate engravings that told the story of a man's journey from slavery to freedom to prosperity. One side depicted hands breaking chains, with the date 1863 marking the year of Josiah's emancipation. The other side showed a family gathered around a home, with carefully engraved words, "For future generations, hope endures, JJ 1877. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Hendricks began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "I am here today to present Miss Maya Johnson with the official authentication results for the historical artifacts discovered on her family property over the past several months." Maya felt her heart racing as she looked out at the crowd. She recognized most of the faces from her neighborhood, though many people who had never acknowledged her existence were now watching her with intense attention. James Foster stood near the front with Patricia Miller and several other neighbors who had spent years treating Maya as an unwelcome presence in their community. After extensive analysis by federal authentication experts, Dr. Hendricks continued, "I can confirm that Miss Johnson has discovered a collection of historical artifacts with a total estimated value of $150 million. The number landed on the crowd like a physical blow. Maya watched as people's faces registered shock, disbelief, and in some cases what looked like anger or resentment. A few individuals began whispering urgently to their neighbors, while others simply stared at Maya with expressions she couldn't quite interpret. This discovery represents one of the most significant examples of African-American wealth preservation during the Reconstruction period ever documented. Dr. Hendricks continued. The artifacts were originally buried by Maya's great-great-grandfather, Josiah Johnson, in the 1870s and 1880s, and have remained hidden until Miss Johnson and her dog, Rex, began their excavation work earlier this year. Maya stepped forward when Dr. Hendricks gestured for her to speak. The crowd fell silent, and Maya felt the weight of their attention in a way that was both overwhelming and oddly empowering. These were the same people who had watched her struggle for years without offering help, who had whispered about her behind their hands and treated her as if she were somehow less worthy of basic respect and kindness. I want to thank Dr. Hendricks and her team for their careful work in authenticating my family's collection, Maya began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. This discovery has taught me things about my ancestor and my family that I never knew, and I'm grateful to finally understand the legacy that Josiah Johnson preserved for future generations. As Maya spoke, she noticed Harold Miller pushing forward through the crowd, his face flushed with what appeared to be embarrassment and desperation. Behind him, Patricia Miller looked pale and anxious, as if she were only now beginning to understand the implications of how they had treated their newly wealthy neighbor. "Maya," Harold Miller called out, interrupting her prepared remarks. "Maya, I hope you know that Patricia and I have always cared about your welfare. We've been keeping an eye on you all these years, making sure you were safe." Maya looked at Harold Miller with the same steady gaze she had learned to use when adults tried to rewrite history for their own benefit. The crowd had turned to watch this interaction, and Maya realized that this was her moment to address not just Harold Miller's false claims, but the broader pattern of treatment she had endured from her community. "Mr. Miller," Maya replied calmly, "I remember our interactions very differently. I remember you complaining about my property, bringing down your neighborhood values. I remember you calling me a wild animal and suggesting that authorities should remove me from my home. I don't recall you ever offering help or showing concern for my welfare." Harold Miller's face grew redder as the crowd began murmuring among themselves. Several people were clearly uncomfortable with Maya's direct response, while others seemed to appreciate her honesty about how she had been treated. Kyle Foster appeared next to his father, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious nervousness. "Maya, come on. You know we were just kids being kids. We didn't mean anything serious by the stuff we said. We were actually just trying to be friends with you." Maya turned to Kyle with an expression that mixed sadness with wisdom far beyond her years. "Kyle, you called me trailer trash and welfare queen almost every day for 3 years. You threw rocks at Rex and told your friends I was crazy. That wasn't friendship, and we both know it." Rex had been standing calmly beside Maya throughout these exchanges, but she noticed that his posture had shifted to a more alert stance as Harold Miller and Kyle Foster approached. His protective instincts were clearly engaged, though he remained controlled and dignified in his response to the tension. The crowd was beginning to shift restlessly, with some people looking uncomfortable about the public airing of how Maya had been treated, while others seemed fascinated by her direct confrontation with neighbors who had clearly mistreated her. Maya realized that she had an opportunity to address the broader community about respect, dignity, and the responsibility that came with how they treated the most vulnerable members of their society. Dr. Hendricks stepped closer to Maya, offering silent support as the situation became more emotionally charged. The federal official had witnessed enough authentication ceremonies to recognize when community dynamics created complications, and her presence provided Maya with additional credibility and protection as she navigated this difficult moment. Maya took a deep breath and looked out at the assembled crowd, recognizing that what she said next would shape how her story was remembered and how her community moved forward. The golden medallion caught the afternoon sunlight, its engravings telling the story of her ancestors' hopes for exactly this moment, when his descendant would have the strength and resources to stand up for herself and chart her own course. "I want to say something to everyone who's gathered here today," Maya began, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made the crowd settle into respectful attention. For the past 3 years, I've lived in this community as your neighbor, and many of you have treated me as if I were somehow less worthy of basic respect and kindness. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rustle of autumn, leaves in the breeze, and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. Maya felt Rex's comforting presence beside her and drew strength from the knowledge that her ancestors' sacrifice had finally given her the platform to speak truth that needed to be heard. Maya looked out at the faces in the crowd, seeing her entire community gathered in a way that had never happened before. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her front yard, and she felt the weight of history, both her ancestors' story and her own, settling around her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. What I've learned from my great-great-grandfather's story, Maya continued, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the gathered crowd, is that dignity doesn't come from how much money you have or how big your house is. It comes from how you treat other people, especially people who can't do anything for you in return. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. Josiah Johnson faced challenges that most of us can't imagine. He was born into slavery, won his freedom, built a successful life, and then had to hide everything he'd worked for because it wasn't safe to be a prosperous black man in 1877. But he never lost hope that someday his family would be able to reclaim what belonged to them. Maya's voice grew stronger as she spoke, drawing confidence from the story of resilience she had inherited. I've spent the last 3 years living as your neighbor, going to school with your children, shopping in your stores, walking past your homes, and most of you treated me like I was invisible, or worse, like I was some kind of problem to be ignored or eliminated. The crowd was completely silent now, and Maya could see that some people were genuinely uncomfortable with her direct assessment of their behavior. Others looked defensive, while a few appeared to be experiencing genuine remorse for how they had treated her. I'm not saying this to make anyone feel bad, Maya continued. I'm saying it because what happened to me happens to other people in our community every day. People judge each other based on appearances, on circumstances, on things that don't really matter. And that judgment hurts real people. Martha Henderson stepped forward from the crowd, tears visible on her cheeks. Maya, honey, I am so deeply sorry for how we failed you. You were a child who needed support, and we were too comfortable in our own lives to see that or to help. Maya looked at Mrs. Henderson with appreciation for what felt like the first genuine apology she had received. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I know you tried to be kind when you could, and I've always appreciated that. The moment opened something in the crowd, and several other people began speaking up. Some offered apologies that seemed sincere, while others made comments that sounded more like attempts to associate themselves with Maya's success than genuine remorse for past treatment. James Foster pushed forward again, his face red with frustration. Now wait just a minute, Maya. I think you're being a little unfair here. Nobody in this community has ever meant you any harm. We were just living our own lives, dealing with our own problems. Maya turned to James Foster with the patient expression she had learned to use when adults refused to take responsibility for their actions. Mr. Foster, 3 months ago, you told the town council that my property was an eyesore that should be condemned. Last week you offered to help me manage my discoveries in exchange for a percentage of any profits. I don't think you're in a position to tell me how this community has treated me. Several people in the crowd murmured their agreement with Maya's assessment, and James Foster stepped back, clearly realizing that his attempt to control the narrative had backfired. Mayor Patricia Wells, who had remained silent through most of the ceremony, finally approached the microphone. In her hands was a formal document that Maya hadn't seen before, an official letter with the town seal. Maya, Mayor Wells said, her voice shaking slightly, the town council held an emergency meeting last night to discuss how our community has failed you. We've prepared this formal apology, signed by all council members and many residents, acknowledging the way you've been treated and asking for your forgiveness. Maya accepted the community apology letter with steady hands, noting the weight of the official paper and the careful language that someone had obviously spent considerable time crafting. The document acknowledged oversights in community support and missed opportunities to provide assistance, though Maya noticed it stopped, short of admitting outright cruelty or deliberate exclusion. "I appreciate this gesture," Maya said after reading through the letter, "and I want everyone to know that I forgive the hurts of the past. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean that everything just goes back to the way it was." Maya paused, looking out at the faces of people who had been her neighbors for years, but were only now really seeing her as a person deserving of respect and consideration. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do with my inheritance," she continued. "My ancestor saved this money, hoping it would someday help his family build a better life. I think he would want me to use it not just for my own benefit, but to create opportunities for other people who face the same kinds of challenges I've faced." The crowd's attention sharpened as Maya outlined her vision for using her wealth to benefit the community. She spoke about plans for a community center that would provide after-school programs and support services for families in need. She described scholarship programs for students from low-income families and economic development initiatives that would create jobs and opportunities for everyone. "But here's what's important," Maya said, her voice taking on the firm tone she had learned to use when making non-negotiable points. "These programs will be for everyone, regardless of their family's economic situation or social standing. And they'll be run with the understanding that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Rex had remained calm and steady throughout Maya's speech, but she noticed that his tail was wagging slightly, as if he approved of the direction the conversation had taken. His presence continued to provide her with emotional stability during this overwhelming and historic moment. As Maya concluded her remarks, she looked out at the crowd and saw a mixture of reactions that reflected the complexity of human nature and community dynamics. Some people appeared genuinely moved by her words and committed to change. Others looked resentful or calculating, clearly focused more on how they might benefit from Maya's wealth than on the deeper message about dignity and community responsibility. But Maya also saw something that gave her hope. Young people in the crowd who were listening intently, who seemed to understand that her story represented possibilities for how communities could treat their most vulnerable members with greater kindness and support. "I want to end by saying that I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my family's story with all of you," Maya concluded. "Josiah Johnson's hope for future generations has finally been fulfilled, and I promise to use his gift wisely and generously. I hope we can work together to build a community where every child feels safe, supported, and valued." The applause that followed was mixed, enthusiastic from some quarters, polite but reserved from others. Maya understood that real change would take time and consistent effort, but she felt confident that she had used this moment to establish clear expectations for how she wanted to be treated and how she intended to treat others in return. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya remained on her front porch with Rex beside her, holding the community apology letter and watching her neighbors walk back to their homes. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light that made even her humble cabin look dignified and beautiful. 1 year later, Maya stood on the front porch of her cabin, the same weathered steps where she had once sat in lonely isolation, the same view of the neighborhood where she had once felt so unwelcome. But everything had changed, including Maya herself. The cabin remained her home by choice rather than circumstance. Maya had renovated it carefully, preserving its humble character while making it comfortable and safe. The sagging porch had been Rebuilt, the roof repaired with matching shingles, the windows replaced with energy-efficient glass that still maintained the original proportions. The old oak tree in the backyard now shaded a small memorial garden, where Maya had planted flowers to honor Josiah Johnson's memory. But the most dramatic change in Maya's landscape was the building that now occupied the lot across the street, where the Miller's pristine white colonial had once stood. Harold and Patricia Miller had sold their property to Maya 6 months earlier, and the house had been demolished to make way for something far more significant: the Josiah Johnson Community Center. The community center was a beautiful modern building designed to serve families of all backgrounds and income levels. Its glass and stone facade was welcoming and dignified, with wide doors that remained open during operating hours and windows that allowed passers-by to see the activities taking place inside. Above the main entrance, carved into a cornerstone of local granite, were the words that had become Maya's guiding principle: built on the foundation of hope, Maya's legacy. Maya walked across the street to the community center, as she did every morning before school, with Rex trotting beside her. Rex had become something of a celebrity in the neighborhood. Children would run up to pet him and thank him for finding Maya's treasure. And adults who had once complained about his presence now greeted him warmly and kept treats in their pockets for his visits. Inside the community center, Maya paused at the display case near the main entrance. Behind the glass, carefully preserved and beautifully lit, was her mother's tarnished silver locket, alongside a selection of artifacts from Josiah Johnson's collection. The display told the story of Maya's family across generations, from slavery to freedom to prosperity to struggle, and finally to renewal and hope. The plaque beneath the display case read, "In memory of Amelia Johnson, who raised her daughter to believe in dignity and possibility, and in honor of Josiah Johnson, whose hope for future generations made all of this possible." Maya smiled as she read the familiar words, still feeling the emotional connection to the ancestors who had shaped her story in ways she was only beginning to understand. The morning activities at the community center were already underway. In the main hall, elderly residents were participating in a fitness class led by Mrs. Martha Henderson, who had volunteered to coordinate senior programming after her heartfelt apology a year earlier. Through another window, Maya could see Kyle Foster leading a group of younger children in an art project, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine enthusiasm for working with kids who reminded him too much of how he had once treated Maya. Kyle had been one of the most surprising transformations in Maya's community. After months of awkward attempts to apologize for his past behavior, he had finally approached Maya with a simple request. He wanted to volunteer at the community center as a way of making amends for the years of cruelty. Maya had accepted his offer cautiously, but Kyle had proven himself through consistent, humble service that seemed to reflect genuine remorse and personal growth. "Morning, Maya," Kyle called out when he spotted her in the hallway. "The kids have been asking when you're going to come read to them again. They loved hearing about Rex's adventures." Maya smiled at Kyle, still sometimes amazed by the transformation in their relationship. "I'll come by after school today. I've been working on a new story about a dog who helps a girl discover buried treasure." In the community center's main office, Maya found Jennifer Peterson Walsh reviewing applications for the Josiah Johnson Scholarship Program, which provided full college funding for students from low-income families throughout the region. The program had already awarded scholarships to 15 students in its first year, with plans to expand significantly as Maya's investments continued to generate returns. "Good morning, Maya," Jennifer said, looking up from a stack of applications. "These scholarship essays are incredible. You're going to be amazed by the young people we're supporting." Maya had insisted that scholarship recipients be selected based on character, academic potential, and community service, rather than just financial need. She wanted to support students who demonstrated the same resilience and determination that had carried her through her own difficult years. The community center also housed a business incubator program that provided low-interest loans and mentorship for local entrepreneurs, and a food assistance program that served families in need without the bureaucratic barriers and stigma that often accompanied traditional welfare services. Maya had structured all of her programs to preserve dignity while providing practical support, remembering too clearly how it felt to need help while being made to feel ashamed for needing it. Maya's own education had flourished along with her community involvement. She attended a prestigious private school now, though she had chosen one that was close enough to home that she could remain actively involved in the community center's daily operations. Her grades were excellent, and she had already begun planning for college with an eye toward studying public policy and community development. But Maya's greatest education came from the daily work of managing her wealth responsibly and learning to lead with both generosity and wisdom. She had discovered that having money made it easier to help people, but it also required constant vigilance to ensure that her help was truly beneficial rather than creating dependency or resentment. As Maya prepared to leave for school, she paused. In the community center's main hall, where a group of preschoolers was playing under the supervision of their teachers. The children's laughter filled the space with joy and energy, and Maya felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that these kids were growing up in a community committed to treating every child with dignity and support. Rex waited patiently by the door, his intelligent eyes watching Maya with the same protective attention that had sustained her through the loneliest days of her childhood. He had been with her when she was invisible and forgotten, and he remained by her side now that she was one of the most recognized young people in the state. The walk to school took Maya past houses where she had once been treated as an unwelcome presence, but now neighbors waved from their porches and children called out greetings. The transformation wasn't universal. Some people remained resentful or calculating in their interactions with Maya, but the overall climate had shifted toward greater kindness and community connection. Maya understood that lasting change took time and constant effort, but she also knew that her story had planted seeds of possibility that would continue growing long after she moved on to college and whatever adventures awaited her beyond this small town. As Maya and Rex reached the school boundary, where they had said goodbye every morning for years, Maya knelt to scratch behind Rex's ears and look into his wise, loyal eyes. "What do you think, boy?" she asked quietly. "Are you proud of what we've built together?" Rex's tail wagged enthusiastically, and Maya could have sworn she saw approval and contentment in his expression. He had found the treasure that changed everything, but more importantly, he had provided the constant love and loyalty that gave Maya the strength to use that treasure wisely. Maya stood and looked back toward the community center, where the foundation stone caught the morning sunlight, and reminded everyone who passed by that hope could endure across generations, that dignity could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations began with the most humble discoveries. The girl who had once been mocked for living in a broken cabin had become a symbol of possibility and redemption for her entire community. Josiah Johnson's hope for future generations had not only been fulfilled, it had been multiplied beyond anything he could have imagined when he carefully buried his family's treasures beneath an old oak tree, more than 130